1, 2, 3. Good. No? Good?
Mine has like, I'm getting feedback. Would it be possible for me to just put a mic up there?
Who else is having issues?
I don't have it.
Yeah.
Sounds perfect. Mine sounds fine too.
Mine's sounding like.
It might be a cable.
No, I didn't want to have my feet in the way.
I thought you thought I was kicking you or something.
Oh, no. I would make you encrypt.
Yeah.
Okay.
You think it's this?
Okay, now it's gone.
All right.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
think it's this.
the loss of life in our jails. We have seen an increase over the past few years, and oftentimes the questions are, well, what is MCSO doing about this? My response is everything reasonable, possible, and within our powers. But that does not mean that we are miracle workers and that we can offset what is the most, I hope that you quote me on this, the most devastating aspect, the most challenging problem that we have in society and in our nation today is drug addiction, drug abuse, and primarily led by fentanyl. It will take more lives over the course of, a year than I think we lost in many of the wars that we've had in our history. I would tell you that when it's all said and done, we felt the pain of COVID, and I assure you, fentanyl will take more lives than COVID did. It is the most highly addictive, most highly dangerous, and it takes lives every day in our streets, in our schools, in our homes, and in our jails. So this is not a problem. Someone asked me, do you have a problem with drugs in the jail? We have a problem with drugs in society. And who is in our jails? People with mental illness, people who practice crime as a career, people who are drug addicts, drug dealers, and drug traffickers. So our population by far is the exaggeration of what ills our society. So as I go through these statistics, it's to ensure that you understand we are transparent. I'm giving you all the information. But I also want to educate you on how hard the men and women work to offset this problem, because just like me, they feel the same way, that life is precious. And even when we're talking about those who have done egregious things in our community and are being held accountable in our jails, we still respect their space, their health, and their lives. So as you'll see in this first statistic, I wanted to show you the increase in inmate deaths in our jail population. The blue represents those who have died while being transferred into our custody. So they're not yet in our custody, but they're in our jails, brought in by other agencies and being processed. And they've had some type of whether it's a drug overdose or a cardiac arrest or whatever it may be, but those who actually never made it inside the formal aspect of our walls, but were being transferred to our custody. The yellow represents those who have died while incarcerated in the 5 Maricopa County jails. You can see the increase, and I will tell you that it is directly impacted by fentanyl in 2 ways, or other drugs, but fentanyl primarily. One is the addictive properties and the threat to life that it poses. The other is you have to understand that the last few years under COVID, our jail population went from an average of about 8,500 inmates per day to just above 4,000 at the peak of COVID. And it has slowly climbed since that time to where the average daily rate of inmates in our jails is about 6,700 today. So proportionately, it's not that we had the same population and there was a considerable surge in deaths in the jail. It is that our population rose and proportionately the loss of life rose with it. This is not an excuse. This is not an alibi. I am just giving you data. The next slide, you'll see the cause of death. We've categorized it. Because for some of you, when you talk about deaths in our jails, I think that our audience may view that as though it is due to abuses by the detention officers. It is due to violence within the jail population and other factors. There are, just like in society, contributors to the loss of life. Some die of natural causes. Some die of drug-related issues, overdoses. Some commit suicide. And there are violent crimes that occur in our jail. So in the last year, you saw that we had a few homicides. I'm going to spend a little bit of time right here before we move on. Several years ago, prior to COVID, I had a concern that there were too many suicides, and one is too many, but too many suicides in our jail. And at that time, I'll say I commissioned, I don't know the better term, a group to work specifically on the issue of suicides in our jails, to try to determine what were causal effects, what's going on in the environment that we can change or alter in some way to reduce anxiety, what services were we providing and what services should we be providing, what resources or tools are available that are facilitating inmates' opportunities to take their own lives. The members who participated in that group represented our Maricopa County Sheriff's Office detention officers, the programs, the training division, jail crimes investigators, classification, correctional health medical representatives, and mental health representatives. The number one priority was to make sure that the data that we were discussing was the same language for everyone that was represented there, because sometimes correctional health and MCSO may see or view or turn things differently. So it was getting the same information so that we could evaluate it. Things that were considered were the length of stay. Does the length of stay directly impact why someone's anxiety or issues rise to the level so much so that they feel that their pain and suffering of an addiction or withdrawal or something is so severe that they decide to self-harm? Was it the charges, that they're facing such severe charges they know that the incarceration is going to be lengthy? Was it how we were housing them? Was it the time of day? Was it segregation versus general population? How are we housing them? Those were all things that were considered. And at the conclusion of that, we made several changes. Everyone receives a tablet when they come into our custody. And every time you sign on to that tablet, the first thing that appears is information related to if you are suffering from some form of anxiety and thinking about self-harm, that there are resources available to you. There's inmate education, an acknowledgement that those services exist so that we know that you read it. There are 26 mental health courses that are bilingual. 11 of those courses are suicide prevention. We pass out literature. We have a Custody Bureau Intel unit that monitors communications that go from those tablets, both in text as well as phone calls. And there are certain trigger words that if an inmate is using those words, that we are alerted, and then we send correctional health to go meet with that person to see if their intentions are to self-harm. We have advanced training for our employees specific to indicators that show that a person is considering self-harm. And it includes ways for us to try to intervene and interact with them to better ascertain the issue. One of the things that goes on, first and foremost, is that when someone is booked into our jail, correctional health conducts a very thorough interview. And the interview has multiple facets and multiple objectives to determine if they have medical needs, what medications they're using, if they have mental health challenges and need some form of counseling, if they are addicted to drugs and need help, or if they are considering self-harm. We're happy to send you a copy of this so that you can look at it on your own time. This is how many pages it is. Okay, I'll hold it up over here so you can see a little better. Every inmate is questioned. And if correctional health determines that they are at risk in some reason, then it'll affect how we house, what resources we send, because we have those flags to indicate that they are a higher risk inmate. That is us being proactive. Now imagine that you are an inmate coming into our custody and you're being interviewed about these things, and what goes through your head is, if I tell the truth, how I am housed, where I can stay, and what's available to me may be limited or mitigated because I'm in withdrawal and thinking about hurting myself, and I don't want to get locked up in a room where, although my safety is enhanced, my ability to interact with others is reduced. What if you're a drug addict and your addiction is so severe, because this is what fentanyl is. Pay attention to what I'm about to say. Your addiction is so severe that in order for you to manage it, you know you've been sentenced, you have to report, you violated probation, whatever it may be, and you are reporting to jail, that you are willing to take anywhere from 10 to 200 pills and put them in some type of packaging and insert them into a body cavity so that when you enter the jail, you can conceal that contraband and bring it in with you, not only to maintain yourself, but to sell them inside to make money. You're doing that with the knowledge that if those are discovered, you'll face additional charges. Or if for some reason while in your body cavity they are exposed, that it will take your life. That is about the highest level of desperation that you can imagine for an addict. And it happens with regularity. And we'll get to some of those images in a little bit. But my point is that when a person goes through screening and we're doing our best to ascertain if they're a threat to themselves or others, you may find this hard to believe, but criminals with addiction aren't always honest. So although we are reaching out with an olive branch to try to help them and provide services, they are unwilling to accept it because they're worried about self-preservation in the world that they exist. The next slide will relate to exactly what I was just talking about, the overdoses in Maricopa County, not the jail system, but in general. And you can see in 2019 to 2020, there was a considerable surge, what is about, I don't know if it's a 20% increase, whatever the number is. And it has slowly climbed since that time. So this is in the general populace. How many people are dying every day from drug overdoses where they live in a space and a place that they have control over their environment. They're able to keep up with their addiction so that they don't have the withdrawals or the other issues that they're challenged with. They're willing to risk their lives by continuing to ingest. They have all forms of medical care, not just, and we have medical care in the jails, but not just a limit, but if they have an issue, an overdose, or whatever it may be, they're going to be, paramedics potentially transporting them to the hospitals. But this is the problem that we see in our county every day. And right now, in the first quarter, we're at about 500. So again, we're on mark for over 2,000 in Maricopa County alone. So I'm going to go through some of the responsibilities as we get onto this Narcan slide here that our detention officers deal with every day. And I need you to understand something. Prior to COVID, we had 30 vacancies in the detention side of the house. And when completely filled, it's about 2,200 employees. We had 30 vacancies. Right now, we have over 600 before COVID, after COVID. Why is that? Because during COVID, why would you want to go to work in a place, in a space that is a confined area where their ventilation is shared amongst everyone, where you have a population of about 250 inmates every day that are coming in from the outside and not knowing if they're infected, that you have to put your hands on, transfer inmates every day who, again, have been faced with their own challenges, but their health is not exactly the best condition. And here you are every day coming to work, just trying to wear a mask to protect yourself and your family. We lost about 15 detention officers to COVID. We face challenges unlike any other profession. We had to reform everything that we did in the jail system to quarantine and to isolate, to test on the regular, to provide security for our correctional health staff, to give vaccinations, to make sure that we were doing everything in those spaces to provide services to the best of our ability. And we were sued. We were sued alleging that we had an environment that was unsafe for inmates and that anyone with any health condition that could be at higher risk should be released from the jails, regardless of why they were incarcerated. And that lawsuit took almost 2 years, where the plaintiff's class that was suing us had access to the jails, got to tour it and go through all of it. And after 2 years, the finding was that we not only met expectations but exceeded them and were so exceptional in our practices for public health in addition to public safety that the lawsuit, it was found in our favor with prejudice. And if you want to pull it, please do so, because you'll see the judge's words were very, very clear and concise, acknowledging how hard the detention staff worked to keep people safe. But while that was occurring, we had to eliminate additional access, which is volunteers and programs specifically for drug recovery, religious practices, counseling services, because we couldn't allow more population while following the best practices recommended by the nation on how to run that facility. Had we diverted from that, we probably would have lost the lawsuit. So we followed the rules to make sure everybody was safe and abided by that according to the courts, but in doing so, we depleted resources that are intended to help inmates. So here's what a detention officer does every day, and I told you what the vacancy ratio is. We're about 600 down from 30. Not only do they manage intake, which incorporates about 250 new inmates every day, but we also transfer that same number out of our custody every day. They provide food service for 6,700 inmates twice a day. They escort and do security for all the medical visits for CHS staff. They do transportation to and from all of the courts, as well as providing security in the courts. They escort inmates not only to the hospitals if they need care, but even to specialized appointments for medical care providers. And when doing so, the ratio has to be 2 detention officers for every inmate. So if we have multiple inmates, 7 inmates would take up 14 detention officers. They do laundry exchange, they do court security, they transport between the jails, they do video surveillance. They do pod walks every day to check on our inmate population, and it's usually anywhere from every 20 to 25 minutes. They do cell searches, they provide programs and education, they do canteen delivery, they investigate internal crimes. That just scratches the surface. But this slide right here is what else they do. They deliver more Narcan, I would be willing to bet you, in our jail system than anywhere else in our community. I have directed that the majority of our staff be trained in Narcan. So 1,430 detention staff members were trained since October of 2022. In total, 1,989 employees have been trained to administer Narcan. Over 5,000 doses have been issued to staff. And if you look at the bottom, it goes from 2021 to the first quarter of 2023. In 2021, 117 individuals were administered Narcan. That doesn't mean one dose. That means at least one and oftentimes multiple. The following year, it went up to 172. The first quarter, we've already done it 96 times for inmates. Basic math tells me that we're going to exceed 200, most likely, this year. So when people infer that our detention officers are inconsiderate or incompassionate or don't care enough about caring for that inmate population, it is the furthest thing from the truth. And it's easy to cast that stone from a distance, but walk in our jails and see how these men and women treat the inmate population every day, and then you'll understand how decent they are and how professional they are and how hardworking they are. So in addition to that, we investigate things in the crimes in the jails, and I told you about the addiction and the practice. So the next slide shows you the volume of seizures in our jails, and I'm going to focus primarily on the fentanyl. In 2020, put on my glasses, I'm a little older than I used to be. There were 559 seizures, or I apologize, this is the grams. 2021, it went up to 1,200. 2022, it was at 3,100. The first quarter of this year, it's been over 2,000 grams. So again, basic math tells me that's going to be 8,000 grams at the end of the year if we keep pace. And the next slide shows you some of the images that happen at intake. The baggy top left is fentanyl, and yes, that was removed from someone's body cavity, as was the middle one. The one on the far right is Suboxone, which is like a methadone. It comes in the form of paper. Sometimes they'll mail that in. They'll dilute it in the drug of choice, and they'll mail it into the inmates and try to get it through and pass our jail crimes. And once it's received inside the jail system by an inmate, and oftentimes they'll try to disguise it with legal mail, they'll tear off little pieces and sell them to the inmate population. All you do is eat it, and you get high. The bottom left was a cell search. That's how much fentanyl was recovered. The bottom right, I believe, was another one that was in a body cavity. Next slide, you'll see cocaine. You'll see a battery that's concealing fentanyl that was recovered at intake. The bottom left is a mask where an inmate was concealing the drugs inside the mask once they were already in custody. And I can just keep showing you images, but if we'll leave those there for a second, G. The Constitution restricts us from conducting body cavity searches at intake. So we do a very comprehensive search of inmates when they come in, but we don't have the lawful authority to go into your personal space, into your body. And I will reiterate, imagine the desperation and the addiction if you're willing to do that and jeopardize your own life as well as the potential of additional charges by trying to conceal them in that place and space and bring them in. So we're going to show you a video in a second here. It's of our intake. It'll show you how they're processed when they come through the doors, and it will also show you the room and how many inmates every day occupying a space where our detention officers are trying to process them. And I'll say this, and I hope that you don't get offended by it. Every day in your profession, you come to work and you have an entire shift to put together what is most likely a 2-minute story. And it's hard. It's complicated. You've got to find interviews and do a lot of work to put those 2 minutes together. Sometimes you get multiple days to do a story. Every 2 minutes for a detention officer in our jails is like an entire shift. Every 2 minutes is handling a person who is potentially violent, addicted to drugs, mentally ill, trying to circumvent the system in some way, desperate, broken, fearful, anxious. That's what every day is like. So when you see this video, it'll give you at least a little taste of the volume that they have to deal with every 12-hour shift that they go to work. G, go ahead and show that video, please. This is intake. So what you see here is a body scanner where the inmate will first go through, and their property goes through the x-ray machine. After he goes through the body scanner, he'll go over to where the pads are on the wall, and the detention officer will conduct a search, a hands-on search of the individual, and then the individual will go through those other, on the far right there, that other x-ray machine. So for the person, there's 3 stages for the search, and for their property, there's 2 stages. So this is the ITR. When someone first gets booked into the jail, this is where they are. This is where they're processed. So all these stations are everything from healthcare and medical evaluation. Sometimes there's other jurisdictions who are verifying any potential warrants. It is medical, it is mental health, it is everything imaginable so that we can ascertain as much information as possible about the person coming into our custody so that we can provide appropriate care. This environment was changed with our new jail, and I think it's important to point out because prior to this, we used to house everybody in a cell. You would go into a cell, about 15 other inmates, and you would wait for your name to be called to be processed. The ITR was designed to make it more communal and open so that it reduces anxiety for the inmates, and we treat them with a heightened level of respect as long as they are respectful in return. As long as they don't act in a violent manner, then they're allowed this freedom so that we can do everything in our powers to facilitate their process, whether it be onto the courts or into the jail system. This is the second stage. These are inmates waiting to go in front of the, I believe it's going to front of the court, in front of the judge to determine if they're going to be held with or without bond, or if they're going to be released. And you can see there's one detention officer who's responsible to try to keep an eye on all those inmates while the other detention officers are working to process them. The wall, those 4 doors or 5 doors, excuse me, that's the restrooms. That's where the inmates can go in there. Now imagine if they got in through our first door and into the space and they have put something into their body cavity and they've already gone through the searches, then they're heightening their chances of being able to conceal that contraband until they're incarcerated. Or sometimes they go in and ingest. But unfortunately, I say this not to be a calloused police officer or sheriff, but to be honest, as I've always committed. The people that you see in this room are people who are alleged to have committed crimes, many of whom have been convicted of previous crimes. So their behavioral pattern is to circumvent the law, to pose a threat to other people. Not everybody, but let's not pretend as though you're looking, at the pews in a church. That's not the population we deal with. So what has the sheriff's office done to try to combat this? There's a reason you're seeing an escalation in the seizures. It's because of a dedicated effort by the employees to be more aggressive in what we do. A few years ago, we were certified by the National Commission on Correctional Health Care because of the exceptional services that we provide. That's due to hard work every day. I'm sure you're all familiar, but I've just recently purchased body scanners to ensure that not only our inmate population, but our employees, volunteers, correctional health, and everyone coming into the jail system will go through some form of search to make sure that we're not contributing to the problem and violating the law. I recently directed my tactical operations unit, which is the SWAT team, along with a special response team that works in the jails, that they do surprise searches in the pods. They're very aggressive, not with the inmates, but with their entry, so that it comes by surprise and it gives an inmate less opportunity to try to either conceal or destroy or get rid of the drugs that they have. And then they turn over the entire pod trying to recover drugs. We have cross-trained, I believe, 4 of our canines now to identify fentanyl. It seems like, well, if you use them all the time, Sheriff, wouldn't that solve the problem? Well, when a dog is doing a search for fentanyl, they're usually effective for about 40 minutes before they need a break. It's that exhausting for the dog. So with 5 jails and 6,500 inmates, that's a lot of ground to cover, and you can't cover it every day. But the population changes every day. I'm considering purchasing 4 more dogs and dedicating 4 detention officers to solely manage those dogs specifically for searches in the jails. And we are in the process of reinstituting programs that include the volunteer staff, faith-based community, and drug recovery experts to get back up to speed on the things that we were doing so exceptionally before COVID, like our Mosaic program. So that's a lot of information I threw at you, specific to this, and I can see in your faces you're all bored. That's too bad, because I don't like turning on the TV and seeing stories that are less than 2 minutes where the representation is solely from someone who is suffering because the loss of a loved one. And the narrative is not covering all the complexities to what could have occurred, but telling a story that misrepresents the work by the good men and women in this system who are trying to keep people alive. I'm sorry to loved ones who have lost family members in our jail system for any reason. Drug addiction, suicide, violent crime, health issues, whatever it may be. That is a loved one. And it's a void you can never replace. And I'm sorry for your suffering. But if we are going to address and solve this problem, you will not solve it from inside the jails out. We will solve it by prioritizing as a nation the fact that we have the most threatening chemical dependency that's ever faced our nation, and it is destroying all lives, not just young lives. And as a government, as a society, as a community, if we don't prioritize it, the list will get longer, and it's going to take extreme commitment to education, rehabilitation, recovery, and incarceration to target the people that are selling poison to our children and to our families, making profit knowing that every one of those pills could and will likely eventually take a life, if not in that first dose, in the 10th or the 50th. That is not a me problem, that is an us problem. And I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to work to overcome it. But it's time for us to stop pointing fingers and start looking in the mirror. I'm looking in the mirror to see what I can do in the sheriff's office to improve. A couple other issues I'm going to go over quickly, but I'm going to be very cautious in doing so because they're still in process. There's another bone to pick for me. Being the first to tell a story doesn't make good journalism. Be the first to tell an accurate story does. Sometimes you come to us with questions about issues where we have not yet received all the information, like autopsy reports, or a completion of an investigation so we know all the facts. And I don't like to speak before I have accurate information, but I know it's commonplace for the media to feel the need to represent the story before information is presented. There was a man who died in our custody, Adam Scott Delk. I'm sorry to his mother, who I know is suffering. He was arrested in October of 21 by the Glendale Police Department for 2 counts of aggravated assault. On the 16th of February, he was in the day room sitting with some of his inmate peers. Stood up from the table, walked to his cell, past a few detention officers, and when he got into his cell, seemed as though they were having some conversation when suddenly his cellmate got up and yelled for help, and the detention officer ran there immediately. Within 2 minutes, the detention officer was at the door. And they can't go there by themselves and go in because there is still that threat of some form of an ambush in the cell. So he was being cautious at the cell, standing outside, and immediately radioed for correctional health and other detention officers to come to render aid. Within 2 minutes, they were there. They delivered Narcan, they utilized the AED, and they delivered CPR in an effort to save his life. He was then placed on a gurney with the Phoenix Fire Department, transported to the hospital at 11:10. That was within 12 minutes of us being alerted, or about 14 minutes of being alerted. At 11:51, he died. Later that day, at about 4:55 or so, our staff made contact with his mother, deliver the news, and speak to her, because it's an investigation anytime somebody dies in our jail. And again, I do not want to exploit or do more harm to a woman who has lost her son. Nobody should feel that pain. But we need to be honest about what happened. And the autopsy is still not yet completed. But we do know that that gentleman had health concerns. At one point in time, he had a lump in his leg about a year ago. And his history did show that he had some problems with substance abuse in his past. At least that's the information we received. Thus far, we know we have not gotten all the results back like toxicology, but there was a blood clot and severe cardiac disease that played a part in some way, or at least were identified during the autopsy. As the story was covered on this issue, this is a man who had been in our custody for some time, and the bond was extremely high. And the bond had just recently been reduced by the courts. I may be inaccurate in saying this, but I hope not. My understanding is the report stated, the media coverage, that he was within hours of getting a release from our jail. I'm being told that's not accurate. His bond had not yet been met. It hadn't even been processed yet through our system to set that bond so that it could have been paid. And had it been paid, he still would have been fitted with an ankle bracelet and some other things before being released, so it would have been probably another 24 hours. That does not diminish what happened with this loss of life. But the correlation that he died just before being released, therefore there must be some nefarious act that occurred, is not true. If this ultimately shows that his cause of death was anything other than a natural tragedy, I assure you, I will pursue it to identify why and if anyone is to be held responsible. But we don't have that information yet. So let's not misinform the community as to what went on within these walls when it came to that loss of life. There's other ones I could talk about, but I'm not going to sit up here and defend or preach on some of the challenges in the information. I use that as one example of what is a tragedy, unfortunate, heart-wrenching for family members and friends, but it is a challenge that detention officers deal with in our jails. And they do it to the best of their ability, and they care how they're doing it. And if they mess up, then it's my job to hold them accountable, and it's your job to hold me accountable. I take both those things very serious. How the community judges the job that I'm doing and how I judge the job that our employees are doing. I just ask of you, when you cover a story, your first bit of truth isn't the entire story. All the facts involved are contributors to the issue. And the number one priority in this nation should be stopping fentanyl and other drugs on our streets and holding people accountable, to include other nations who profit by trafficking drugs into our country. So I just went on for quite some time. I'm going to give you about 5 to 10 minutes to ask me questions. If they're appropriate, I'm happy to answer them. If they're beyond the realm of what I should be speaking about today, I'll let you know.
Hey, Sheriff Penzone. Thank you for doing this today. My name is Katie Wilcox. I work at 12 News. The first question I had was, many law enforcement offices do announce every time someone in their custody dies. Is the Sheriff's Department going to begin doing that?
Boy, it's a good question, Katie. I didn't realize that in some form that we're not representing that. If that's something that the community deserves to know, so we'll find the most appropriate form to report that with regularity.
The families that we just talked about, obviously, I've spoken to certainly Ricky Delk, Adam's mother, a number of times. I think her biggest concern was always about the transparency. And have you spoken to her?
I have not.
One of the things that she asked was about getting things like the report, like that timeline you just laid out, the video of his demise, all of those things. And she is concerned, and several other families we've talked to are concerned about the delays in the release. How will you reach out to families more quickly and to get them that information faster? Well,
I just want to make sure that I clarify. When you say reach out to families, I'm always very conscientious and cautious that my role in interacting with families during that difficult time comes with other inherent challenges when we face lawsuits and other things of that nature that represent this office. When it comes to the documents, the reports, the investigation, no different than any other criminal investigation. Until there's a completion, we're not going to release partial information. When it comes to the autopsy, that is not ours to release. That is the medical examiner's responsibility to conduct. And even me sharing what I shared today, they're probably not going to be too happy with me. I know that it's in our report, which is close to finalization, but our report can't be finalized until their report is included. And the video itself, that's probably something I can be more proactive because every shooting that we have, I make sure that I get those out quickly. The in-custody deaths, I have not been as diligent, and I should be. So when it comes to the video related to the loss of life, that's something that I could absolutely be more expeditious with and more respectful to the family. I don't want to cause them more pain or harm, but if they feel that's something that helps them understand what occurred, then that responsibility is mine. So I think there's a balance in some aspects of what you're asking. I can deliver. In other elements, the timeline is not mine to control.
We've sent several other cases, so I'm more than happy to follow up on the specifics of some of the others for similar things.
Sure.
Richard Cano, for example, was a homicide in custody. Same questions, the video, whether there would be charges there. Is it pretty much the same answer for you?
Yeah, I mean, you can speak with one of our PIOs and find out the status of it. I know the frustration for me when it takes a lengthy period of time to even, like right now waiting on toxicology and other things, but I also understand the burden and the backlog and the challenges. I can only imagine family members wanting answers. Because in every situation, I'm sure the first inkling is why. Why did the person that I love, what caused their demise? And the more time that passes, I'm sure the more your mind starts to wander into places where you think that maybe something nefarious did occur. So we should and we'll look for ways to be more, as I said, expeditious and better at releasing that. But the other things that you have questions about, I think it'd be best to just talk to the PIOs and find the status of them. And then we can try to project timelines, but we're not always going to hit them.
Absolutely. One thing that you brought up was that initial screening for people who may have suicidal ideations or are going through withdrawals. And you pointed out that sometimes they're not going to be completely honest. I wondered if the jail does anything about those who are booked on drug-related offense specifically to send them down a different route. If we know that they're either currently intoxicated, they were booked with having the drugs, in their car, in their system, possession, and that kind of thing. Do they have a different?
I don't. God, it's kind of a complex question. The only time we're going to do something different that immediately sends more resources in the direction of that inmate is if we believe there's a potential for a health risk or a self-harm risk or mental health risk. If it is just someone who has a history of drug use, that is such a high percentage in our jail system and such a commonality, unfortunately, in our society that in and of itself does not rise to the level that is deemed to be above a threshold where suddenly they're at greater risk. And that's unfortunate because you would think just in fundamentally that it would. It's just not realistic, and unfortunately it's too big of a problem. I'm trying to, there was another part of your question that I wanted to answer to. I apologize, it'll come back to me. But let me do this. I promise I'll come back to you, but sometimes some folks get out in front and it becomes a one-on-one, but there's other folks in the room. So anyone else have a question? Before? Yeah, I know, and I'm sure you understand why we're doing a one-on-many now.
Sheriff, why are you calling this press conference today? Is there a catalyst that brought you here that you felt like you needed to address all this? Why is this happening now?
Hi, who are you? Who are you with?
Taylor Tessler, KTAR.
Hi, Taylor. Well, when I talked about the detention officers and the complexities of their job and everything that's going on, that goes from the highest rank in the organization to those at the line level. When I hear that my community has a concern with unanswered questions and I feel that it's something that it's appropriate, timely, and important for me to get in front of the cameras, then I do. But every day that goes by, because we deal with this, not to diminish it, but with such frequency, it's hard for me to decipher that it has risen to the level that the community needs to hear from the sheriff. So I will tell you, recent stories have absolutely caused me to feel uneasy with the manner that the work being done by the men and women is being represented. It also requires me to make sure I'm giving clarity to the loss of life. I'm doing that to the best of my ability with limitations today. But this is not a new problem. This isn't just suddenly, oh my gosh, there's a problem in the jail with people dying. Unfortunately, this is always a reflection of society and it occurs. But the capacity and the volume right now is unsettling. And it's not unsettling in the jails, it's unsettling in our world. And again, our jails are the force multiplier of that problem. I don't know if that answers your question. That's the best I can tell you, though. And when the bell rings, I try to answer the bell every time. And this is one of those circumstances where I feel like the bell's ringing, and I want the community to judge me as you see fit, but I'm being as honest as with the information that I have. Who else? Right back there in the corner. Anything? No? All right, back to you, young lady.
Yes, thank you so much. So the other part of the question, I think, was about the suicide ideation specifically.
Yeah.
Part of the rise was drugs, obviously. The other part was suicides. What do you think is the next steps for your office?
So we have interviewed inmates who attempted self-harm and thankfully they were unsuccessful. So they tried to take their lives, and either we intervened and stopped it from occurring, or they were unsuccessful with their effort. And it is not uncommon for us to hear from those who attempted that the suffering from the fentanyl addiction is so painful that they choose to take their own lives as opposed to suffer. So, in my opinion, we need to figure out a way not to put the burden on detention officers, but to supplement the resources inside the jail, which correctional health is under the same burden we are, to determine how we can be more aggressive and proactive in immediately bringing people that are in our system into a space and a place where they feel safe to communicate their issues, and that we can provide resources to help them overcome them. As an example, we do have, where's Chief Dawson? Methadone and other things. We use chemically supported programs in our jail for people who are suffering from addiction. Is that fair to say, Chief? And I don't know the answer. And I hate to keep using COVID as the reflection, but when COVID started, we didn't know how to address the loss of life. And over time, we improved in some ways, maybe not as much as we should. It's no different now. So as things are discovered or revealed, or we do research and we find best practices to help inmates, we'll absolutely implement them. But right now, we're doing the best we can with the resources we have, and I believe it to be the best that there is. We just need to do better collectively.
It does sound like a resource issue. Obviously, you said you're down 600 staff. That sounds like a huge burden. Have the drug courts helped divert people from your jails?
No, I think what we're seeing right now is, I'm not saying drug courts don't help, but we still have a backlog. The courts, the prosecutors, people that have been sentenced to serve time for everything from like a DUI where maybe that could not during COVID. Suddenly that's all kind of that dam is now down and that water is flowing. So that's why we're seeing an increase in the population. Do drug courts help? I'm sure they do. Do recovery programs and rehabilitation? I spent 6 years in narcotics. I cannot, and I deem myself an expert, tell you what the tipping point is for a person who is an addict to finally not only seek help, but embrace help so they can overcome this issue. For some, it's multiple times. So in the jails, when we were able to fully run the Mosaic program, we had a 7-week program that lined up with your release date and then 7 weeks post-release to try to get you care, and it was chemically supported. And we saw great results. I hate to be a guy who stands in front of you because I promise you this. I have an exceptional executive staff that I meet with on a regular basis, and they come up with great and creative ideas to improve our services. But this drug problem now requires, I would tell you, I believe the President of the United States needs to prioritize the issue of fentanyl addiction, distribution, trafficking in our nation as job number whatever, 1.2, whatever number it is, because I don't know what else he's got on his desk. But you can't go to sleep on this one.
The last question I really have for you, although of course I have many more, and I'd love to continue the conversation.
And I promise I'm not going to be short, but I actually have to go speak at something regarding election security in a few minutes here.
Do you know how many of the inmates that died in custody since 2020 were pre-trial, awaiting conviction or any other outcome?
I don't. I can find that out, or at least we can try to get you that statistic, and I can kind of sense where you're going. Like, is custody the best place for someone that's pre-trial? And there are factors that go into play. So one of the things that I asked of my colleagues, forget for the reflection again, during COVID, please reconsider booking people for nonviolent misdemeanor offenses. If they don't have a history of violence, that means that they are putting the safety of the community in jeopardy, because we needed to drive the population down so we could better manage the issues, the health issues at hand. I think that should be a practice every day. How can we, and do not, I always have to give a disclaimer, confuse this with me being soft on crime. Spent my entire life trying to put criminals in jail, keeping our community safe, so nobody gets a free pass. But if the person that you're investigating is being investigated for a crime where they don't pose an immediate threat to the community, and it is a misdemeanor offense, and it is nonviolent, putting them in our custody just means they're probably going to get out within 72 hours unless they're suffering so much that they self-harm because of the environment. And that doesn't mean that we should give them a pass on their drug addiction. But we should be very thoughtful in how, when, and who we incarcerate so that it is solution-oriented. So this number one solution is protecting our community. Does that answer your question fairly, even though that really wasn't part of your question?
That was a lot. That was part of the question. I think the knowing how many were pretrial is an important.
Yeah, we ain't trying to get that stat. If there's a reason we can't get it, I'm sure Rico will let you know, but I don't have that for you right now, but we can research it and try to find that out.
Okay.
Sheriff, I have one quick follow-up.
I said that was the last one. I'm teasing. Go ahead.
You said this should be a priority of the president's, to address fentanyl. Have you had any conversations with our Senator Sinema, Senator Kelly about this? I know Sinema's talked about really going after the manufacturers and trying to make sure it doesn't go across the border. Have you had any conversations with them?
Senator Kelly has become an exceptional wingman for me. He is highly invested in this office and our efforts, recruitment, in addressing issues of crime. Fentanyl is a priority. He's been exceptional, even to the point, I'm going to bring this up. When I took the office, there had already been legislation passed that removed the retirement system for detention officers and put them into a different program that was a monetary incentive that really isn't long-term. Senator Kelly has committed and has been trying to help me work on restoring that retirement system, because we need to do more to incentivize, reward, and care for the detention staff, no different than the sworn staff, so that they stay in this job as a career and we don't lose them at 3, 4, 5 years. Because the reason we've seen all this attrition partially was the COVID pandemic, other is financial and monetary factors that make them feel less valued. And Senator Kelly has taken the lead every time I've asked anything of him. So I can't tell you where we are on it right now because he's a busy man who travels the world, but I can tell you it's a topic of discussion, and I have the utmost confidence that he's a man of his word and a follow through.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys and ladies.